So today I'm going to be talking about how I basically recovered from intergenerational trauma through shamanism and through somatic therapy. So I'm going to kind of talk about specific logistics around that, specifically related to intergenerational trauma, shamanism, and patriarchy, and sort of how I went from kind of living a really oppressed, I would say, pained life to feeling more freedom, more liberation, and just more access to my creativity and divine feminine awakening. So first, I kind of want to talk about intergenerational trauma and exactly what that is, because I think there's a lot floating. There's a lot floating around out there, I think, about all of these topics, and we sort of kind of get caught up in I think, the heated discussions of them without really understanding what it is we're talking about when we're addressing these things. So intergenerational trauma actually there's two parts of it that I want to talk about, and it's sort of like nature versus nurture. So one of those parts is genetic, and we can look at that through the lens of epigenetics. So epigenetics tells us that intergenerational trauma these are trauma adaptations that are passed down through the genes. And we can scientifically observe this in laboratories. We understand that through laboratory studies, we've been able to see in mice studies that mice remember traumatic events, and it's encoded. It's sort of encoded in how the genes are expressed to the next generation. So whether or not those parents are still present, the next generation of mice remember a sort of threat in their system, and it's not that their genes are coded differently, it's just that the way they're expressed is different. So in that way, these are actually reversible trauma adaptations. So while one generation might have those trauma adaptations, if the next generation chooses to, they can actually change those trauma adaptations if they want. So these are totally reversible adaptations. But a lot of people aren't really aware that these things are taking place. And there's actually, surprisingly, a lot of denial around trauma. A lot of people don't really understand the nature of trauma. They don't understand that there's plenty of scientific evidence to back it up, to understand that especially children who endure trauma in childhood have a much more difficult time in life later on. They have a difficult time in relationships. They struggle in their careers. They really aren't successful sort of by the patriarchal standards of success. So the other aspect of intergenerational trauma is actually nurturance. So part of it is epigenetics. So when our parents experience some sort of intense trauma or threat, and then we're conceived after that takes place, it's highly likely that we will sort of receive their traumatic patterns in our own gene expression. And then there's also the nurturance aspect. So our parents can have a certain way they interact with us and raise us, right, and rear us. And then that's passed down to us as well through sort of our programming, how we're patterned, and how we interact, how we hold ourselves, our posture, our tone of voice, the way that we respond to difficult situations, right? So it's kind of encoded in us through the regulation that we learn through our parents' nervous systems, that we receive that nurturance guidance from them, and that's intergenerational trauma. So it's working on both the nurturance aspect and the nature aspect, which is the genetic aspect. So there was a point in my life in which I kind of looked around and I noticed that my family was really struggling, and we were existing in a lot of things that affect primarily women. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But first, I kind of want to talk about these other two interesting subjects, shamanism and patriarchy, because again, we're kind of entering into territory where there's a lot of buzzwords out there. People have all sorts of opinions on both of those things. But I think in order to really understand how my story panned out, it's important to understand what those two things are and what I'm talking about when I talk about those things. So shamanism is kind of an interesting subject because there's a lot of people who are kind of coming into it, and having these experiences. It's sort of like call it spiritual awakening or some kind of awakening they're having where suddenly they're connected to something that they can't explain and they don't understand what it is, and they go through this process of awakening and having spiritual experiences that are really kind of in the realm of mysticism, and it's really difficult to define. And then there can be a lot of buzzwords around it, a lot of, I don't know, I guess beliefs kind of forged around it, a lot of different ways people talk about it. But I kind of want to look at it just from maybe a little bit of an anthropological lens, because I think that when we understand that this is something that this isn't just some kind of new age phenomena, this is something that actually has existed across the world for thousands and thousands of years, much longer than the patriarchal systems we presently have. In fact, shamanism is often called the world's oldest religion because before sort of patriarchy, Christianity, the Abrahamic religions, and then in other places where other religions have sort of swept across the culture and upended the indigenous spirituality and religion that was innate or inherent to that space, that was native to that area. There was this, we call it shamanism, I guess for lack of a better term, possibly because the term shaman, which is Tungusic, has Tungusic origin, kind of really defines this phenomena that we can kind of see and understand across cultures in pretty much every area in the world, in North and South America, in Africa, in India, in Northern and Southern Europe, across the Orient into Asia, China, Japan, up into Siberia, all across in every region. And there are thousands and thousands of cultures that have these medicine people, these healers, who seem to be in contact with some kind of other reality or some type of, let's say, altered state of consciousness that they're embodying that allows them to connect with this other space. And they're connecting with, a lot of times people call them entities. It's sort of like some people just call them spirits or helpers or guides. There's a lot of different ways that we kind of define these things. But basically, there's this sort of observation anthropologically when we look across the world and across cultures, we see the history, we see that there exist these people who were kind of in communion with some kind of spirit world. And it's really interesting that across the world, we see very similar types of practices in all of these different regions. And so shaman kind of became this sort of universal term that anthropologists began using to define this this sort of culture of practice, these spiritual practices. And so now people kind of throw that word around a lot to define, I think a range of practices that have indigenous roots. So, and when I say indigenous, what I mean is just native roots. It's native to a region or a location. So it seems to be inherent to the people of that location who have been inhabiting that location for possibly thousands of years or longer. We also, sorry, I forgot to mention in Australia too, the Aboriginal people of Australia also have medicine people. So it's pretty much everywhere we find, it's just so fascinating how you find this everywhere. So I'm going to kind of talk about how I kind of came into shamanism and how that was really central in my healing. Yeah, one last thing I want to say about shamanism is there's this Andean shaman who says that the shamans say to think with the heart and feel with the mind. And I really love that because I think one of the major things that I feel about shamanism is it really is about coming into the body. It's about bringing kind of this spiritual, what we consider the spirit world or the spiritual into the body and having a physical embodied experience of it. So we're tapping into the body, we're getting in touch with thinking with the heart, which really just means thinking with the body, realizing that the mind comes into the body and we can actually experience gnosis in the body. And that is this gateway that connects us to this other world. So now I'm going to kind of segue into patriarchy and how that sort of takes us out of that actually and brings us out of the body and into the mind. So we are no longer thinking with our body and we are no longer feeling with our mind. We're just thinking with our mind and we're getting out of the body in this sort of system that we're living in. So, if shamanism is the world's oldest religion, patriarchy is sort of what kind of upended shamanism in the locations where shamanic cultures were colonized, and uh, they kind of had their cultures completely wiped out. Right? We see that in the Americas. We kind of see that with the Roman Empire coming to rise. There's this really great book that I have here. Let me see where I put it. Oh, it's right here. It's called When God Was a Woman. I think it's going to show it in reverse because I have this mirrored up. It's by Merlin Stone. So she goes into really deep detail about the history of patriarchy in this book. I think it's a really wonderful resource to kind of understand the history. And I always just say, keep in mind, these are just theories. We really don't know what happened exactly. We don't know our history. Only that we can really gather from studying different cultures across the world that for the last few thousand years or so, we seem to have this system of male domination that has sort of come into power. And we understand that many places in the world were colonized, and that this sort of globalism, this global industrial force kind of took over, uh, at least a couple hundred years ago. And so now we have this sort of global environment today. But before that, many cultures just lived sort of in these little pockets, these regions where they weren't really so much touched by the outside world. And so you had more indigenous practices present, even in places in Northern Europe, sort of before, there's the whole war that took place between England and Scotland, for example. And so the culture there, the Celtic culture there kind of got wiped out. But before that, there was a really rich sort of pagan history, and you see shamanism present there with like the Druids, and so it is something that we can kind of track throughout the world. We understand that there is a precedence for shamanism in these cultures, and that patriarchy was sort of the system that wiped it out. So patriarchy has two aspects. I like to look at it from two aspects. One of those is religious, and the other part of that is secular. So from a religious aspect, patriarchy kind of claims to be benevolent, right? It's sort of like saying, oh, well, this is benevolent. Men are protecting women. They're the umbrella over the family that protects and shields the family from outside forces, and it's wholesome, it's good, and it's something that we want, right? So in patriarchal cultures that are primarily religious, we see this a lot in Christianity and Islam. We see this sort of patriarchal precedence that women just sort of get in line, they follow the leader, they don't make a fuss, and that's religious patriarchy. So religious patriarchy tends to be monotheistic, although that isn't always the case. But either way, there is this male dominance. So there is this the primacy, the divine primacy is male. It's inherently masculine. We see that there is this sort of male right to preside. It's a divine right that is only given and granted to men. Women do not have this right. Women are often treated like property. They're kind of sold from their fathers to their husbands. The father is usually choosing the husband. And of course, this ranges from culture to culture. This isn't like this way in every single culture. And I'd hate to stereotype it that way. But basically, this system, we can see it through history. We can track it through history. We can understand that although we in the first world, in America and in Europe, and other first world countries, we have a lot of freedom compared to where we were 100 years ago, 200 years ago. But we also understand that it was a battle. It was a fight to get those rights. Women had to rally for those rights. They had to really push for them. It wasn't something that was given to us. It was something we had to fight for. We had to stand up and ask for it. And we had to ask for it very loudly. And in a lot of ways, we still are. So patriarchy is present. It isn't something that is, we can track it in history. We can look at the historical precedents for it. So it isn't an illusion. It isn't something we're making up. It's truly present in the world. I don't even know why I have to say that. So religious patriarchy, right? Then there's secular patriarchy, which is in a lot of ways a lot worse than religious patriarchy. So while while religious patriarchy claims to be benevolent and for women, secular patriarchy sort of objectifies women. It's the complete opposite. So it's devoid of a spirit, it's devoid of a soul. It still has that male dominance present, and it's controlling, it's forceful, and it sort of takes. It takes what it wants. It doesn't ask for permission. It goes in, it overtakes, it overpowers, it steals resources, it takes whatever it can get without consideration for anybody really in that process. And I think that both religious and secular patriarchy have both light and dark sides. So there's sort of the more benevolent side for each of them and a more malevolent side for each of them. And so in the benevolent side, in secular patriarchy, you have sort of like medical advancements, you have a lot of I would say materialistic type advancements that are coming across the world, that are coming as we kind of become more technologically advanced, and we can end world hunger. All of these really seemingly good things are kind of coming from it. On the other side, though, there's this really dark side where you see human trafficking, you see drug and gang violence, institutional power dynamics that are really not good for anybody. You see, again, male domination, you see imbalances of power in institutions. So it just creates a lot of problems. So we've kind of established that patriarchy is a thing. It sort of upended the oldest religion of the world, which is kind of the other name for kind of the nickname for shamanism. We understand that there is this intergenerational trauma present and that it can be rooted in patriarchy. So Valerie Rain is a psychologist who she kind of coined the term patriarchy stress disorder, and she actually has a book about it called Patriarchy Stress Disorder. She's a psychologist with she has a PhD and 2 master's degrees, and in her therapy practice, she started noticing that every single person that she was treating seemed to have an underlying trauma, no matter how severe other types of trauma they were coming in for, or whatever was going on in their life. There always seemed to be this sort of underlying thing that was present in all of her clients. And then she noticed that despite having so much success herself, she was also experiencing that. She also had struggles in life that she felt like shouldn't be there for someone who was as successful as she was. So she felt this sort of low grade, I guess maybe you could call it trauma response. So when she started applying trauma treatment to herself and she got better, she was like, hold on, even though I've never experienced anything traumatic in my life, I have trauma because the trauma treatment is working. So she began to kind of put the patterns together and see what was similar across the board. And that's when she really, truly felt that patriarchy was the common denominator. The sort of system that keeps women with an inherent belief that they are worth less than men. And so she says that at the root of patriarchy stress disorder is an inherent feeling of being worth less than men, and that both men and women can have those beliefs in them. She says that this is thousands years old trauma adaptation that's been passed down epigenetically from parent to offspring, and also through the nurturing environment. So how can we really track this? How can we really look at this and know that this is the truth, right? Because again, all these terms are kind of flung around. There's a lot of controversy around them, a lot of people who feel one way about them, a lot of people, maybe they're religious and they really want to uphold patriarchy. They think that it's good. They want men to be presiding. They want men to be leaders. How can we really look at this and see and understand the harm it's actually doing? Well, I think it's called the International Women's Health and Human, I'm going to forget the name of this. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm forgetting it. Well, anyway, so they were actually able to track 4 of the major health concerns. It's an organization for women's health and human rights, International Women's Health and Human Rights Organization, are able to track 4 of the primary concerns affecting women's health. And the first of those is being born female, which is kind of shocking. I was really shocked when I read this. What was shocking to me about this is that all 4 of these things have affected my health considerably throughout my entire life. And when I read this, I was kind of like, hold on, all this time I thought I thought what was affecting my health was all these other things, that I needed to be concerned about according to everyone else. But then I read these 4 things, and it sort of shocked me, because I was like, wow, the trauma that I carry and is really rooted here. And these really are my 4 primary obstacles in life that really have affected me and affected my health very negatively. So the first is being born female, and I want to kind of talk about why that is. So that might come as a shock, because that's kind of like, well, hold on, girl power, female power. We don't want to say that to girls. We don't ever want to teach that to girls, that being born female is a problem. But worldwide, being born female comes with it demeaning and discrimination, and actually threat of violence. In some places in the world, baby girls are more likely to be killed at birth. They're more likely to be sold into slavery. They're more likely to have tremendous violence done against them. They're more likely to be discriminated against, so they don't have access to the same types of healthcare, education across the board. The mothers who give birth to baby girls are actually also in danger of being of having violence done against them, because they gave birth to a girl instead of a son. So there's this thing called son preference worldwide, where across the world, sons are preferred. And unfortunately, this continues to be the case. It usually affects third world countries more than first world countries. But even in first world countries, you can kind of see the remnants of this. You kind of see it where a father really pushes to want to have a son versus having girls. Or you see people say things like, oh, all girls, huh? That's too bad. It's sort of like this sort of backhanded comments that you might have when presented with that situation. So it could be kind of operating underneath our awareness, right? Because again, these are epigenetic trauma adaptions that have been passed down genetically. So we might not even be aware that we have these types of preferences, and we do. So the next one that really affects women is poverty. So worldwide, more women are living in poverty than men. And so poverty is something that greatly affects women's health. People who have more access to resources obviously fare better health-wise, especially, and I would say that poverty isn't just about money, it's also about access to resources in general, because you could have all the money in the world, but if you don't have access to resources, then you really don't have much of anything. So that would include like a family system that's supportive and nurturing, having access to specialists, having access to healthcare, having access to food, to healthy, whole foods that are nutritious and wholesome. So those types of things, those are the types of things that affect us when we're looking at poverty. The next is institutional discrimination. So that includes discrimination in the workforce, discrimination in institutions such as governments, such as the police systems, and healthcare, and access to food and other types of resources. We kind of established that with number 1, being born female, being one of the leading healthcare risks for women, which is, I know it sounds so strange to say that. This is because of number 3, which is discrimination. It's because discrimination in the institution is so prevalent in patriarchal systems against women. And the final one is violence, and that includes domestic violence, sexual violence, and institutionalized violence, which we see taking place in Iran right now. So worldwide, we can actually track these things. These aren't things that we're just making up. These are visible things. And so these are the types of traumas that we're talking about when we're looking at patriarchy stress disorder. So now I want to kind of segue into my story and what happened with me, and how I sort of looked around my life and realized, hold on, something's not right here. So I was raised in a really, really difficult situation. Both my parents were only 16 when they got married. They had 6 kids by the time they were 24 years old. So I was one of 6 kids in a very young, very poor family. And all of those things on that list that I read off affected my family. So we lived in poverty. My dad was violent towards my mom. At one point in time, he almost killed her in front of all 6 of us. So That was a very traumatic event that happened when I was around the age of 8. My dad was very cruel to my mother. I noticed when I looked at both sides of my family that the sons always were faring better than the daughters. All of my aunts struggled with domestic violence and substance use and just all sorts of obstacles that, especially around career and living in poverty, that my uncles didn't seem to so much struggle with. They had more opportunities given to them. They seemed to just be able to move through life easier. They didn't carry so much heaviness in their systems. It seemed like my uncles were lighter. They had a better attitude and they were happier in life. My aunts just seemed so weighed down with so much heaviness and so much sadness and anxiety. And I just noticed that was present from a young age. I actually noticed that. And it sort of kind of sparked something in me like, hang on, what's going on here? Why is this the case, And then I looked inside my own family system and I was very questioning of it. I didn't really understand what was going on. I was born into the LDS church, so I was raised Mormon. And I just really felt like the power imbalances were wrong. And in my system, they didn't feel right. And I would always question it. And everybody would always tell me not to question these things. Be a good girl, play nice. But I was always adamantly questioning. And I was kind of serious about my questioning to the extent that my voice was kind of, believe it or not, very pushy, very persuasive. So around when I became a teenager, I couldn't subscribe to those belief systems anymore, especially given what happened with my mother. My mother was just between the domestic violence, sexual abuse that occurred from when she was younger, coming up and resurfacing. She would tell me just really horrific stories that were hard for me to hear at a young age. So she had established a dysfunctional relationship with me that was sort of this reverse role dynamic. And I was kind of living, they call it emotional incest in psychology. So it's when a parent has an inappropriate relationship with their child that puts them into a sort of more of a spousal role emotionally. And also it can be a reverse role dynamic where a child is caretaking for the parent and the child is more of the parent to the parent than the child is a parent to the child. So it's a reverse role dynamic. So I entered into this sort of relationship with my mother from a young age. And it kind of flipped back and forth at times, but it was a consistent pattern that kept showing up in my life all the way until actually recently when just for the sake of my own healing, I had to go no contact with my mom and with pretty much the rest of my family so that I could heal myself from all of this. But that pattern of dysfunction followed me way too far into adulthood. So my mom became disabled. There was one point in time where institutionally, she actually had the state of Utah investigating her for fraud, despite the fact that she was truly disabled. And we had these videotapes. I remember watching them when I was little. And I actually liked watching them because it was the only time I really got to see my mom with me. But there were these videotapes of her walking us to school. And one in particular, I remember of her walking me to school. So the police were kind of watching her. They were investigating her, and they arrested her at a family dinner. She was acquitted of all charges. They couldn't prove, that she had committed fraud against the state. And later on in my life, when I was about 13 years old, my mom became permanently disabled after a series of back surgeries went wrong, and she had her spinal cord cut in two. And there was all sorts of institutional abuse taking place around that, and she actually won a lawsuit against her surgeon for the mistakes that he made when he cut into her. So it was quite serious for me. Like I was living this reality, the violence, the institutional discrimination, the religious discrimination at church, being born female, right? I could see clearly that my uncles were doing so much better than the women, that my aunts, and 3 of my aunts have actually passed away on my mom's side. One died from breast cancer. The other had a rare liver condition. But there was sort of this consistent pattern that all of them had been abused by their spouses. And especially my aunt who died of breast cancer, like she was horribly abused by her first husband. So Yeah, so I kind of just looked around. I noticed, hey, this is happening in my life. I see this everywhere. I see that these four things are really affecting my family. I can see that there seems to be this risk involved with being born female, being a female in this society that seems dangerous to me and seems kind of like these patterns keep coming forth of, the women in my family not doing as well as the men in my family. I noticed that even now, my mom is living on disability and she's barely making it in life. My parents are actually divorced, and my dad is living very comfortably and has a very comfortable lifestyle. So even between both of my parents, my dad is faring much better. Um, so I noticed that there was this sort of institutional discrimination present, and it was really hard not to look away from it. It was really hard to sort of everyone was just encouraging me to forget about it. It's just get over it, just let go of the past. And I couldn't. I was just stuck. I was like, but hold on, this is happening everywhere. And I was so impassioned and I really got heavily involved with sort of feminism. And then in my 20s, I got married. Well, actually, like I got married when I was 19, but in my 20s, I gave birth to my first child, and that was when I sort of went on this spiritual journey to kind of heal myself and really come into a type of spirituality that was more represented more what I felt was equitable, fair, and just, and also inherently, I think, who I am at the core of my being. When I kind of talk about shamanism being this original religion, the world's first religion, I feel like it's more accurate to say that it's the native religion. It's the inherent religion of the earth. Because if we were left alone without society interfering and kind of out, we were raised by nature. It is sort of the intrinsic relationship that we would have with everything. And so I kind of discovered a spirituality that's more like that. It's more about my inherent connection to the earth and who I would be if I didn't have all these trauma adaptations. These these trauma adaptations that get passed down from parent to child genetically. Um, so in my 20s, I really didn't want to kind of repeat the same mistakes that my mom made. I didn't want to end up in an abusive relationship. So I married a man who I thought was very loving and gentle, and he has been. We're still married. I'm 37 today, and he's a wonderful partner. He's very loving and kind. And my child is now 17 years old. They are transgender, so they transition from female to male. And I love my family. They're just really wonderful people. I feel like in so many ways I've been able to shift those patterns of dysfunction in my family, although I think it's still an ongoing process because it's so challenging to overcome those things. It's so challenging to overcome the inherent belief of that worthlessness, right? That women carry. I think a lot of women carry. Not all women. I think that some women really feel very strong in themselves and confident in who they are. But that was never my experience. I always felt just sort of, I carried the weight of that worthlessness, that feeling like I was worth less than men. So I was really able to identify with that part of it when I was reading Patriarchy Stress Disorder by Valerie Rain. Sorry, I'm kind of losing my spot here. So I noticed that there were patterns in my family. There were these trauma adaptations that were present. There was trauma bonding. The kids in my family had trauma bonded to my dad. They upheld his position in the family without questioning any of the dysfunctional dynamics present, the domestic abuse, any of it, despite everybody really suffering. There was this hiding. So everybody sort of went out of their way to hide what was happening. And a tendency to hide everything, even in adulthood. So like I said, this relationship I had with my mom carried into adulthood, followed me throughout adulthood. She would be doing well, and then she would spiral and relapse, and she had substance abuse issues from prescription drugs, alcoholism as well. And that would come into my life, and I would take care of her. I would nurse her back to health and get her strong again. And then she would repeat the same pattern over again, go out, find a man, and then repeat the same pattern of usually it had to do with abuse or abandonment. And when she was either abused or abandoned, she would come back to me and I would nurse her back to health, nurse her back to strength. So this pattern would repeat and continue. And there came to a point where it just became so destructive to my soul that I just could not keep doing it. And I finally put a stop to it. So that pattern kind of continued in as I would say, a trauma adaptation. So substance use was a real issue. A lot of my family, my siblings struggle with substance use. Throwing away feminine power, I think, is a really strong one. Like when I look at my mom, I think the most heartbreaking thing to watch happen was that slowly over the years, being abused repeatedly over and over by this sort of male dominance just broke her. And I watched it happen. I saw it happen before my eyes. She went from being this beautiful light and having so much joy in her heart to being broken, spiritually, emotionally, physically broken, and just battered. So that was probably one of the hardest things to watch. I think trying to become successful at any cost, that's a pattern I see in my family. I believe, is a trauma adaptation. So whatever the cost is, we will be successful. We will work ourselves to death. That's a really awful one present in my family system. We will pretend like we have no feelings or emotions, and we will work ourselves to death. The women act like men. The women sort of throw away their feminine power, and all of my sisters really pushed to kind of express themselves in more masculine ways, and to have this type of success that men have. So there is this sort of valuing of that within an environment. So toxic femininity and toxic masculinity, which I think I don't need to go into what that looks like. I think a lot of us can kind of know that. So it's all work and no play. Taking from nature, not really being in a reciprocal relationship with the environment and nature. I think that's a tremendously patriarchal trauma adaptation. Abuse and family dysfunction, avoidance of intimacy is a huge one. Denying instincts, so suppressing our animal instincts, suppressing when we have it. Like, for example, when you're tired, you will keep working. You won't lie down and rest. Or when you have to go to the bathroom, instead of stopping for a break, you'll just push through and wait until you absolutely have to go to the bathroom. So you're denying instinctual impulses. Maybe if you're hungry, you'll wait to eat. So you're not actually taking care of what's present and showing up in the body now. You push and you wait to take care of that. So that would be trauma adaptation. Fitting in to be safe. So that's probably the biggest one of all, right? Is changing who you are so you fit in. And there's all sorts of trauma adaptations that come from that. Not using your voice, never saying no, kind of being a doormat, always saying yes to people please. This is something we know women struggle with. Just kind of feeling like you're doing all of the emotional labor. So these are trauma adaptations that women carry. Yeah, so I looked around and I noticed all of those patterns in my family. I noticed I carried all of those trauma adaptations within myself. And I didn't really think to so much heal it per se. I kind of thought I would just fix it, right? This is something I can fix if I'm just spiritual enough, if I'm just good enough, if I'm small enough. So I want to say about like every patriarchal standard, I have failed. I'm too fat. I don't make enough money. Despite being really educated, I haven't really been super successful in my career the way patriarchy might want me to be. My success is more it's more based in I would say my relationships and how I connect with people, and the way my work inspires people. That's what motivates me. I'm not necessarily out to make profit with my work. So yeah, even in my marriage and as a mother, I have a transgender child. I have a child who is also queer and doesn't fit in by any standard into that heterosexual patriarchal dynamic. So my family system is wildly different than what would be standardly accepted in the patriarchal system. And we have very much rebelled from that. And yet I still see places where I'm living more traditionally. I think my husband and I have sort of dynamic that's a little bit more traditional. And I don't know. It's kind of like understanding, like, who am I? Who would I be without these trauma adaptions? How would I naturally express myself without them? And that's kind of been I mean, maybe you could call it a journey, but that's been the path for me anyway. And it's been a slow unraveling and kind of going into the places where I had trauma, where I had those things present. So there was a period of my life, for example, even though I left Mormonism at a young age, where I actually came back to Mormonism and I had my child baptized in the church. That happened, I think it was in 2013. And I was only there for like a year or so. And then I was like, I don't believe any of this. Why am I here? I can't sit through these sessions in Sunday school. I can't listen to this anymore. I can't hear all of this sort of the male presiding over hierarchy stuff, the denial of a divine feminine, the denial of the divine mother. I can't sit through this anymore. There was also a lot of superiority and just that general sort of domination thing that you see present in a lot of patriarchal cultures, especially present in religious spaces where people think that their religion is the one true religion and everybody else is wrong. So that was present. And I just felt like it was just violent to my system and I had to leave. And then I found Kundalini Yoga and I got really into that. And I still absolutely love Kundalini Yoga. I'm actually studying right now to be a yoga teacher. And then I had my feminine awakening. So I was actually a high school dropout. Like I said, my family was very dysfunctional, and I don't really want to go too deep into the details. I actually only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to try to keep this succinct. But I did, I did go back to school. I got my diploma, and then I went to school. I have an arts degree from the Academy of Art University of San Francisco. But when I got out of school, I was sort of like, what am I going to do? I worked at a gallery and I worked around a lot of painters and I got really inspired and I started painting acrylic paintings and all these goddesses just poured out of me. And so all of my paintings had very common themes of nature, the divine mother, the divine feminine. Shamanism seemed to be present and I don't know where it was coming from. But over the next few years, I had this awakening, this feminine awakening come through where it was like the divine mother was waking up inside of me and I was being connected to her. And then I found shamanism. I was healed by a shaman from a life-threatening condition I had developed that I was going to have neurosurgery to fix. And the shaman did a healing on me and I took radical action with that healing. I removed myself from the group I was in that was revealed to be doing harm to me. And I shut myself off from the teacher who was sort of invading me energetically. And when I left that space, a week later, I healed miraculously from this condition. I had a cerebral spinal fluid leak, so I had cerebral spinal fluid dripping out of my nose. And I didn't have to have surgery, so it was kind of crazy. I was going to have neurosurgery and everything to heal from this. And I was so happy to be healed. So that kind of started this whole awakening where my husband studied to be a shaman. He did a lot of work on me, and I awakened to this practice that brought me into a new sort of way of being and discovering the divine feminine within myself. And that's what led me to become an interfaith minister and to do the work that I do today, writing and teaching other people about and talking about these things in my social network, in social media, pretty much everywhere I'm at. I'm sharing my work. I'm sharing my art on my website. I have a newsletter where I kind of talk about the ceremonies I do as a shaman and as a priestess, which, wow, there's a word right there, right? How much charge is in that word priestess? How much charge is in the word goddess? How much charge is in the word divine mother, right? You can say those to people and they get very uncomfortable with those words a lot of the times because that's patriarchy. Those are those trauma adaptions that are telling us, don't use those words are dangerous. And so I even still have that in my system a little bit, like, oh, I'm using that word priestess. So yeah, I discovered this way of being and I got in touch with who I feel myself to really be. And I'm still healing. I'm still moving through trauma healing through somatic therapy and through shamanism. And so there's so much more I could say about it, but I've run out of time. So I'm just going to go ahead and end my presentation now. And if you want to learn more about me and my work, you can visit srimati.com and kind of check out what I'm up to.